Hey good people, Batavia here. So something I'm commonly asked is, what do I use to make up my container soil? So I'm going to share that with y'all today in a couple of different ways. We're going to start off with making it from scratch, so to speak. So this is what my original base was, and then we're going to transition into another method that I use more commonly because I have a bunch of used or spent potting soil that I refresh every year. And so in that version, we're actually also going to go through the full process of planting out in one of our containers. All right, let's dig in. Okie doke. So the first mixture, and you can consider this a base, especially if you're starting out, I have 1 part topsoil, 1 part compost, and 1 part peat moss. So alternatives to those are, for your topsoil, you could sub in your garden soil, just any garden soil you'd buy from the grocery store. Do you buy garden soil from the grocery store? Well, maybe, but you could also sub in native soil from your garden or from your yard. For the compost, of course, you could use your own homemade compost if you'd like. And then for peat moss, you could sub in coco coir, which is a much more sustainable product. So for all 3 of these, they are sitting in 2-gallon buckets. There's nothing special about 2 gallons. It's just easier for me to manage. And to note, if you ever see a white bucket in my garden, it is absolutely a bucket that I have collected from a grocery store. Their delis, their bakeries. I've kindly asked the folks that work back there if they have any buckets to spare. So I've gotten things that range from 1 gallon, 2 gallon. The prize is a 5 gallon, and I've actually gotten a bunch of 4 gallons too. They work really well. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get this mixed up, and we're going to talk about a couple of the amendments that I'll add as I'm preparing and ultimately going to plant. Okay, doke. So we have our topsoil. Then we have our compost, and then we have our peat moss. And once we get this all mixed up, we'll make adjustments as needed. So before we start breaking this up, you could see the difference in kind of color. This is the topsoil, and this is the compost, and then of course much easier to detect the peat moss. I'm going to actually put on some gloves for this. Okay, how you mix this doesn't matter. If you had a larger amount, you'd probably find it easy to use a shovel. I'm going to go ahead and mix it by hand. It also gives me a chance to break up some of these chunks. What's the saying in most cooking videos or recipes? Mix until well incorporated or until well combined. This looks really good to me. This is the texture that I'm looking for. I talk about this a bit as it relates to kind of crumbly soil. I pulled out some regular potting mix, what I would buy from the regular store, and you could see similar traits. There is one piece that's missing from this mixture, that's in this mixture, and you can see the white specks here. That's perlite. And so I have that here, and as I'll mention throughout, I'm not connected to a particular brand when it comes to a lot of these things, the exception probably being my compost. And just another note, I'm doing this outside, which is recommended. Be careful of inhaling this kind of stuff, peat moss and the perlite in particular. Pouring it in, maybe a little bit more. And just eyeballing it, it's probably going to need a little bit more. So probably 2 cups. So that would work out, right? 2 gallons of compost, 2 gallons of topsoil, 2 gallons of peat moss. And if this works out, 2 cups maybe of perlite. Just mix it until it looks and feels good to you. Perlite helps with, looks like I inhaled, excuse me, helps with drainage. So our container mix from scratch is finished. The potting soil or potting mix that I bought from the store, it does have a softer feel, It's probably more ground up compared to this. I can feel the difference, but this is okay. I've grown in this kind of mixture before, and it works out just fine for your containers. The only other note that I would add, granular fertilizer. I'm becoming much better when it comes to keeping containers fertilized, or at least starting out with fertilizing them. So once I actually plant out, I'll add fertilizer, and we'll talk about that in the next method that I use. I'll actually put this in a bin where I've been storing some of the container soil that's ready to be used in my containers. So that is the first version. Let's go ahead and take a look at the method that's much more common for me now, using kind of spent potting soil. So basically, if I were to plant in this year, what do I do with this soil next year? So we'll show you that. Okie doke, so we have our spent potting soil. We're starting with, it's spent because the nutrients that I added last year has basically been used last year while growing. And I am just separating it a bit, just making sure I don't have any big chunks. Looking at it, it's very fluffy. That's what I want. I want to make sure that the soil isn't too dense. I'm going to pull out any of the roots from last year that won't serve a purpose. That looks like a peanut, a squirrel probably tucked away. I want to add now back some nutrients to it. So my go-to is going to be compost. I'm going to start with a 2-gallon container of compost. So looking at this, it looks good. The texture feels good. It's crumbly compared to being super dense. This is what I want. I basically did a 5-gallon bucket of spent potting soil that I grew in last year, and then I added a 2-gallon bucket of compost. I still have perlite in here. So for now, this mixture is done. I couldn't find my larger drill bit. I have one that's like 3/4 of an inch. So this is basically 1/2 inch, and I drilled a bunch more holes in. I can dump this in, and whatever doesn't make it into the bucket makes it into my little bin here. Let's see, maybe a little bit more. Because remember, this soil is going to be compressed, over the course of the season. So I want to leave room for the mulch as well as the planting hole that I'm going to create. 1 5-gallon container down, many more to go. We have our 5-gallon bucket here, and then I brought in the compost that I use. This is the compost that I use both in my raised beds and my containers. It is something that was recommended to me some years back, and I've continued to use it, and I'm very pleased with it. So that's what I mixed in earlier when I was making up this potting mix. I use kind of whatever I can get my hands on as far as fertilizer. So I have granular fertilizer in this jar here, and I'm brand agnostic, right? So this is one brand, and the measurements are 444, so very even as it relates to the NPK. The recommendation is to apply it every 4 to 6 weeks or as needed, and it's based on the size of the container when you're planting in containers. It gives measurements for other types of plantings that you're doing. So seeds and new plantings call for 1.5 tablespoons per 4-inch pot. So that's a pretty small pot. That's more like the 2-gallon container bucket that I had earlier on. This measures at 12 inches. So you can do the calculations if you wanted to follow this specifically. For comparison, a 16-inch across pot, which is pretty large, it would call for 1.5 cups of fertilizer. So that's about the jar that I have here. This is about 12 ounces of fertilizer. Again, what's recommended and then what I'm going to do. In some cases, they're going to be two different things. So I'm going to just sprinkle some on top, and I'm going to mix it in well. Generally speaking, once I add fertilizer to these containers once in the season, as things grow, I may come back in top dress, I think is the reference that many use, scratch in some more fertilizer at the soil level, and then water it in. But for now, I'm going to go with what I have here for fertilizer. So that's the measurement for this fertilizer. I have a different brand that I've used, another organic granular fertilizer, and it has about the same recommendation. Potted plants, it says mix in 2 cups per cubic foot of soil. And then a smaller measurement is 1.5 tablespoons per quart, right? You know, so again, you could be adding a lot of fertilizer, and I'm sure many people do, to these containers. Between the potting soil that I started with, the compost that I added, and then that's probably a 1/4 cup, if I had to guess, of fertilizer, I feel pretty comfortable. You know, you kind of have to stretch some things out depending on kind of what your garden space looks like, how many containers you have, and so forth. So I'm going to get this mixed up, and then we're going to actually plant and then mulch and water in, and we'll be done. Okay, so I'd say I mixed in the fertilizer probably in the top half of the soil. And now that I'm looking at this, I probably could use a bit more soil. That is about 4 inches from the top, and we don't need 4 inches of mulch. So we're gonna give this plant a little bit more room to grow in. So to avoid this adjustment, some people will actually completely water their container before they actually put the plant in. This measures at about 6 inches long, the spade. So I'm gonna say that's about 2 inches from the top. We'll add just a little bit more because we again know that once we add some water, you know, and then over time, this is gonna get compressed. I'm gonna plant my pepper plant here, pulling off the cotyledons. I believe that's how it's pronounced, those leaves, so I can plant the pepper plant a little bit deeper. Make sure I support the stem. And actually I'm going to pull off these leaves as well. It looks like they're a little bit damaged from the wear and tear as they've been outside over these last few weeks. And then we're going to add some mulch. I'm using shredded leaves here, and I try to do this bit with gloves just because you never know what's inside of these leaves. You want to make sure that you're not using flat or whole leaves, because again, that's another opportunity for this top of the container to get matted. This of course will break down over the season as well. I'm adding the mulch not only to protect the soil that's in the container, but to retain a bit of the water. I don't have so many worries about weeds inside of my containers. I mean, it does happen, but that's not typically a struggle I have over the course of the season. And I know it kind of sounds like it's conflicting. On one hand, we want to make sure there's proper drainage, but on the other hand, we want to make sure that we are retaining water where we can. It is a little bit of a dance that you're doing, so you just don't want all of your water to completely escape, and you don't want your plants sitting in water as well. So that's when we talk about most plants don't like wet feet, I think the saying goes.